The air in Greater Hope Baptist didn't just carry the scent of floor wax and expensive perfume, it carried the weight of expectation. Vivian Montgomery stood at the center of the sanctuary circle, her back straight, her crown of curls catching the amber glow of the stained glass. At 56, she was the architectural soul of the congregation. If a marriage was failing, they called Vivien. If a child was wayward, they sought Vivien. If the church finances were low, Vivien prayed until the windows of heaven rattled. Lord, we thank you. Vivian's voice rose, rich and steady, a velvet cello in the quiet room. We thank you that you are a restorer of paths. We thank you that what the locust has eaten, you return twofold. Around her, a dozen women murmured, Amen, and yes, Lord. They saw a woman draped in a royal blue suit, a woman whose husband, Thomas, was a deacon and a pillar. They saw the blessed life. They didn't see the text message burning a hole in the pocket of her blazer. Don't wait up. Dinners with the consultants. Might stay at the club tonight. Tea. It was the third consultant dinner this week. Vivien knew the scent of those consultants. It smelled like vanilla bean body spray and expensive gin. For 30 years, she had patched the cracks in her marriage with scripture and starching Thomas's shirts until they could stand on their own. She had built a fortress of fine around a hollow core. Touch the broken-hearted, Father, Vivien continued, though a sharp, cold needle of pain suddenly pricked the center of her chest. She ignored it. She was a Montgomery. She didn't have time for needles. Bind up their wounds. Remind them that you never leave nor forsake. The needle became a claw. Vivian's breath hitched. A bead of cold sweat rolled down her temple, graying her foundation. She gripped the hand of Sister Martha to her left. Martha's hand was soft, but Vivian's grip was a vice. Vivien, Martha whispered, her eyes fluttering open. You okay, sugar? Vivien couldn't answer. The sanctuary began to tilt. The vibrant reds and blues of the stained glass bled together like a watercolor left in the rain. She felt the secret rot of her life, the lonely nights, the silent dinners, the papers she'd found hidden in Thomas's gym bag, all of it rising up to choke her. She had spent 30 years being the rock, but rocks don't breathe, and rocks eventually erode. I spent 30 years, Vivien gasped, the words barely a shadow of her usual resonance. The circle broke. The women reached for her. I spent 30 years praying for everyone else's healing. The pain exploded, a white-hot star behind her ribs. Vivien! Someone call 911! As she began to sink to the red-carpeted floor, her last conscious thought wasn't of the scripture she had just quoted. It was of the silence in her house. She realized, with a terrifying clarity, that if she died right here on the carpet of a greater hope, the church would weep for a saint, but her husband wouldn't even have to change his dinner plans. The hardwood of the altar rail clipped her shoulder as she fell. Lord, she wheezed, her vision narrowing to a tiny pin-sized hole of light. I'm tired of being the rock. Then the amber light went black. The sound of the choir's rehearsal in the basement was replaced by the distant screaming wail of a siren, racing toward a woman who had finally run out of strength to hold up the world. The smell was the first thing that returned to her. Bleach, ozone, and the sickly sweet scent of industrial lilies. Vivien opened her eyes to a ceiling of acoustic tiles, white and perforated like a million tiny puncture wounds. A steady, rhythmic beep. 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 Pulsed in her ear. A mechanical tether keeping her anchored to a world she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to return to. Mama? Vivien turned her head slowly. Her neck felt like it was filled with rusted springs. Sitting in the vinyl guest chair was Tasha, her only daughter. Tasha was 32, a polished image of her father, all sharp angles and expensive silk. She was looking at her phone, her thumb flickering over the screen with a frantic energy. "Tasha!" Vivian's voice was a dry rattle. Tasha jumped, dropping her phone onto the linoleum. "Oh, Mama, you're awake. The doctors, they said it was a stress-induced cardiac event. They've got you on all kinds of drips." Vivian tried to sit up, but the wires snaking out from under her thin floral gown pulled taut. "Where's your father? Did someone call the deacons? I have the bake sale committee at 4. "Mama, stop!" Tasha stood up, but she didn't move toward the bed to take Vivian's hand. She stayed by the footboard, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Daddy isn't coming." A coldness, sharper than the ICU air, settled in Vivian's chest. "He's at work? The consultants?" "He's at the house, Mama. Packing." Tasha reached into her designer tote bag. Her movements were jerky, clinical. She pulled out a thick manila envelope. The weight of it seemed to strain her wrist. He said he couldn't do the hospital scene again. Not after your mother, and not with the way things have been between you two." Vivian watched, paralyzed, as Tasha stepped forward and placed the envelope on the rolling meal tray. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. "What is that, Tasha?" "It's a fresh start," Tasha said, her voice rising in a defensive pitch. "Daddy's been unhappy for years, Mama. You know it. You just cover it up with choir robes and potluck dinners. He says he feels like he's been married to a building, not a woman. He says he's tired of being second place to Greater Hope Baptist." Vivian's fingers, trembling and pale, reached for the envelope. She slid the top flap open. The words at the top of the first page were bold, black, and final. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor spiked, turning into a frantic gallop. "He's leaving me? In here?" Vivian whispered. She looked at her daughter. The child she had raised on Proverbs and Sunday school, the girl she had shielded from Thomas's temper and his disappearances for decades. "And you're delivering them? For him?" Tasha looked away, her jaw set in the same stubborn line as her father's. "I just want him to be happy, Mama. He's finally breathing again. You should try it too." The betrayal was a physical blow, more agonizing than the heart attack. Her daughter wasn't a witness to her pain. She was an accomplice to her execution. "Get out," Vivian said. "Mama, don't be dramatic." "Get out!" Tasha snatched up her phone and her bag, her heels clicking a sharp, dismissive rhythm against the floor. "The nurse will be in for your vitals. I'll call you later." The door swung shut, the heavy plastic seal hissing as it closed Vivian into a tomb of silence. Vivian looked at the papers. 30 years of sacrifice, 30 years of yes, deacon, 30 years of God will fix it. She felt a surge of hot, righteous rage, the kind she had spent her whole life suppressing, because it wasn't Christian. She wanted to scream, to rip the papers into confetti, to throw the heart monitor through the window. Instead, she reached for the only other thing on her nightstand, her Bible. It was a worn, leather-bound King James, the edges gilded in fading gold. With shaking hands, she folded the divorce papers in half. She didn't put them in the trash. She didn't hide them in the drawer. She tucked them deep inside the Book of Psalms, right against the spine. She pressed her palm against the leather cover, her heart still racing against the machine. "All right, Lord," she whispered into the sterile dark. "You saw it. You heard it. I'm tucked in your word now. If I'm going to die in this bed, I'm going to die holding the truth." She closed her eyes, the salt of a single tear disappearing into her pillow, just as the door handle turned. A shadow fell across the floor. Not the soft, familiar tread of a nurse, but a heavy, rhythmic step. The machine was coming. The door didn't just open, it surrendered to the presence of a man who moved with the terrifying efficiency of a scalpel. He didn't look at Vivian. He looked at the tablet in his hand, his thumb scrolling through the digital wreckage of her cardiovascular system. He was younger than Vivian expected, perhaps in his late 40s, with a jawline that looked carved from obsidian and hair swept back with military precision. His white coat was so starkly pressed, it made the hospital linens look gray. "Patient 402, Vivian Montgomery," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, devoid of the hospital honey tone the nurses used. It was the sound of a man who dealt in facts, not feelings. "That's me," Vivian said, adjusting her Bible over the lump of divorce papers. She tried to summon her first lady poise, but it was hard to feel regal in a gown that tied at the back. "And you are?" "Dr. Sung-Ho Park, Chief of Cardiology." He finally looked up. His eyes were dark and utterly unreadable. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't offer a greeting. He stepped to the bedside and began checking the IV ports with fingers that moved like a pianist's, fast, certain, and cold. "Well, Dr. Park," Vivian said, trying to bridge the icy gap, "I've heard you're the best in the building. I've been praying for the hands of the physicians this morning." Sung-Ho's hands paused for a fraction of a second. His gaze shifted to the Bible on her lap, then back to the monitor. "Prayer won't fix a localized occlusion in the left anterior descending artery, Mrs. Montgomery. Science will. You have a high-grade stenosis. Your heart is essentially an engine running on a clogged fuel line. If we don't intervene, the engine seizes. Permanently." The analogy stung. Vivian felt a flash of the old fire she used to keep the church committees in line. "I'm not an engine, doctor. I'm a woman who has had a very long day." "Biologically, you are a pump," he countered, his voice flat. He moved to the foot of the bed, scribbling a note. "Emotions are just chemical spikes that complicate your recovery. If you want to leave this hospital, you need to stop feeling and start complying. I'm scheduling a catheterization for tomorrow morning. No food after midnight. No exceptions." He turned to leave, but Vivian spoke up, her voice catching him at the door. "Doctor?" He stopped, his hand on the heavy plastic handle, but he didn't turn around. "You look like you haven't slept since the Great Depression," Vivian said, her tone softening from indignation to a strange sudden pity. "And I noticed you're not wearing a ring, but you've got the shadow of one on your finger, a tan line that hasn't faded yet." Now he turned, slowly. The clinical mask didn't slip, but something behind his eyes flickered, a brief, jagged spark of something that looked a lot like a wound. "My personal life is not on your chart, Mrs. Montgomery," he said, the temperature in the room dropping 10 degrees. "No, it isn't," Vivian replied, leaning back into her pillow. She saw it then. It wasn't just that he was tired. It was that he was hollow. He moved with the grace of a living man, but his spirit was under a sheet in the morgue. "But I've spent 30 years looking at people's souls, Dr. Park. You call me a malfunctioning engine, but at least my heart is still trying to beat. Yours looks like it gave up a long time ago." The silence that followed was heavy enough to trigger the sensors on the heart monitor. Sung-Ho stared at her, his jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. For a second, Vivian thought he might snap, might yell, might show a flash of human heat. Instead, he simply adjusted his glasses. "Midnight," he repeated. "No food." The door hissed shut behind him. Vivian let out a long, shaky breath. A moment later, Deborah, the night nurse, slipped in with a fresh bag of saline. She had overheard the exchange from the hall. "Don't take it personal, baby," Deborah whispered, clicking the IV pump. "We call him the machine. He's got the best hands in Texas, but he's got zero heart. Ironic, isn't it? A cardiologist who forgot how to feel. Vivien looked at the door where he had vanished. He didn't forget Deborah. He's just protecting what's left of it. She reached down and touched the Bible, feeling the sharp edge of the divorce papers beneath the leather. She was a woman losing a husband. He was a man who had clearly lost everything. Lord, Vivien whispered, her eyes closing, I think you put me in the wrong room. Or maybe you put him in mine. The ICU never truly slept. It existed in a twilight of humming machines, the soft squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, and the occasional jagged cry from a room down the hall. It was 3 a.m. Vivien lay propped up by 3 pillows, the divorce papers still a heavy, hidden weight inside her Bible. The physical pain in her chest had subsided into a dull, throbbing ache, but her spirit was restless. She had always been a night owl of the soul, a woman who did her best business with God when the rest of the world was silent. She didn't pray silently. Vivian Montgomery belonged to a generation that believed if you didn't speak it, you weren't standing on it. Father, she whispered, her voice a low, melodic friction in the shadows, I'm not going to complain about Thomas tonight. You saw the papers. You saw Tasha's heart. It's in your hands. If that's the door you're closing, then I'm going to trust the lock. In the hallway, Dr. Sung-Ho Park stood at the nurse's station, staring at a computer screen that had gone into sleep mode. He was technically off shift, but the 4 walls of his apartment felt like a tomb. So he stayed. He always stayed. He was reaching for a lukewarm cup of coffee when he heard it, a voice drifting through the cracked door of room 402. Usually, patients at this hour were groaning or calling for water. This was different. This was a conversation. He moved closer, driven by a clinical curiosity that quickly morphed into something he couldn't name. He stopped just outside the heavy door, his shadow stretching long across the floor. But Lord, Vivian's voice continued, I need to talk to you about that boy. That doctor. Sung-Ho froze. His hand reaching for the door handle retreated. I don't know what kind of fire he walked through, Vivien said, her voice softening with a mother's intuition. I don't know who he lost that made him turn himself into a stone. But Lord, that's a heavy burden for one man to carry. He's out there trying to fix everyone else's heart because he can't find the pieces of his own. Sung-Ho's breath hitched. He felt a sudden, violent prickling behind his eyes. He hadn't been called a boy in 20 years. He hadn't been talked to God about since his mother had stopped calling him from Incheon. Sit with him tonight, Father, Vivien prayed. When he goes into that cold office and shuts the door, when the silence gets too loud, just let him know he doesn't have to keep the world spinning all by himself. Soften the clay, Lord. Remind him he's still human. Sung-Ho backed away. 1 step, then 2. He felt as though she had reached through the door and stripped him of his white coat, his titles, and his arrogance, leaving him standing there in the hallway as nothing more than a grieving man. The machine was malfunctioning. His chest felt tight, not with the stenosis he diagnosed in others, but with the suffocating weight of 10 years of unwept tears. He turned and bolted. He didn't walk. He fled toward the elevators, the sound of his own frantic heartbeat ringing in his ears. He reached his office, slammed the door, and locked it. The room was dark, saved only by the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds. With trembling hands, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He reached past medical journals and stethoscopes until his fingers touched a small silver frame. He pulled it out. In the photo, a young woman with a radiant smile leaned against him, her belly swollen with the life they had been weeks away from meeting. He had been a resident then. He had been a man who believed in a God of grace. Softening the clay, he whispered, his voice cracking in the dark. He closed the drawer hard, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He told himself it was the exhaustion. He told himself she was just a meddling, religious woman who didn't understand the science of grief. But the seed had been dropped into a crack in the stone, and for the first time in a decade, the stone was beginning to itch. The morning light in the ICU was unforgiving, a cold surgical gray that turned the white sheets into a landscape of salt. Vivien felt every year of her 56 as she watched the nurse cycle through her morning blood draws. Her chest felt lighter, but her spirit was a bruised thing, tucked away behind the practiced smile of a deacon's wife. When the nurse left, Vivien noticed it. On her rolling meal tray, pushed slightly to the side of the hospital's standard-issue plastic water pitcher, sat a ceramic mug. It wasn't hospital plastic. It was heavy, a deep celadon green, with steam curling from the top in lazy, fragrant loops. She reached for it, her fingers curling around the warmth. It didn't smell like the bitter, over-steeped black tea from the cafeteria. It smelled of honey, ginger, and something floral and crisp. The scent of an orchard after a rain. Slices of pale, translucent fruit floated at the bottom. Korean pear tea. She looked toward the door, but the hallway was a blur of blue scrubs and hushed voices. No note, no signature, just the warmth. She took a sip. The sweetness hit the back of her throat, soothing the rawness from the intubation tube she'd endured days ago. It felt like a quiet, "Thank you," or perhaps, "I heard you." The peace lasted exactly 3 sips. Her phone, buried under her pillow, began to vibrate with a violent mechanical persistence. She didn't have to look at the caller ID to know the frequency. "Hello, Thomas," she said, her voice steadying as she leaned back. "Vivien, you sounding better. Good." Thomas didn't ask about her heart. He didn't ask if she'd seen the sunrise. His voice was clipped, the sound of a man who had already moved his furniture in his mind. "Tasha said she gave you the papers. I need you to look at the writer on page 12. Vivien looked at the green mug. "I'm in the intensive care unit, Thomas. I'm looking at a heart monitor, not page 12. "Don't do that. Don't play the martyr," he snapped. The deacon mask was gone now. This was the man who had spent 3 decades resentful of the very light she brought to others. "The house in Sugarland. It's too much for you to manage alone, especially now with your condition. I've got a buyer lined up. Private sale. If you sign the quitclaim today, I can have the equity check split by Friday. It'll cover your medical bills, Vivien. Think of it as me doing you a favor." A favor. He wanted her to sign away the roof over her head while she was still tethered to a machine. "The house my mother helped us down pay on?" Vivien asked, her voice dropping an octave. "The house where I hosted every Sunday dinner for your family for 20 years? "The house that's in my name, Vivien, mostly. Just sign the papers. Tasha's coming by this afternoon with the notary. Don't make this a scene. It's not Christian to be vindictive." The hypocrisy was a sour taste that the pear tea couldn't wash away. He was using her faith as a silencer. "You're right, Thomas," she said, watching a single steam cloud vanish into the air. "It's not Christian to be vindictive, but it's also not Christian to cast your wife aside in her hour of infirmity. I won't be signing anything today. I'm busy." "Busy? Doing what? You're in a hospital bed." "I'm busy living," she said, and she hung up. She set the phone face down on the mattress. Her heart was thundering, the monitor chirping a warning rhythm. She took another long, slow sip of the pear tea. The warmth spread through her chest, a strange, sweet shield against the coldness of the man she had called husband. She didn't know that 3 doors down, in a darkened observation room, Dr. Sung Ho Park was watching her vitals on a central station monitor. He saw the spike when the phone call started. He saw the steady, cooling descent of her heart rate as she drank the tea. He adjusted his glasses, his face a mask of granite, but his hand stayed hovered over her data just a second too long, And then he hadn't written a note because he didn't have the words. He only knew that for the first time in 10 years, he had woken up and felt the need to provide something that couldn't be found in a medicine cabinet. The sirens that afternoon were different, sharper, more frantic. In the ICU, the air grew tense as the code blue alert crackled over the intercom, not for a patient in the ward, but for an incoming trauma in the ER. Vivien watched through the glass partition of her room as the atmosphere shifted. Nurses who had been leisurely charting suddenly moved with a predatory focus. And then she saw him. Dr. Sung-Ho Park was sprinting. His white coat snapped behind him like a cape. But it wasn't the speed that caught Vivian's attention. It was his face. The machine was gone. In its place was a man who looked like he was running into a burning building to save his own life. "What is it, Deborah?" Vivien asked as the nurse hurried by to prep an overflow station. "High-speed collision," Deborah whispered, her face grim. "Young woman, 7 months pregnant. They're bringing her up to surgery now." Vivien felt a cold shiver. She reached for her Bible, her fingers pressing into the leather. "Not today, Lord. Please, not today." The next 2 hours were a blur of muffled shouts and the frantic clatter of surgical trays. From her bed, Vivien could see the hallway leading to the OR. She waited, her own heart ticking a nervous rhythm on the monitor. Finally, the double doors swung open. A gurney was wheeled out, headed for the neonatal unit. A tiny bundled form was visible, a miracle. Then came the mother, pale but breathing, surrounded by a jubilant team of residents. They had done it. The residents were high-fiving, their voices buzzing with the adrenaline of a win. But Sung-Ho wasn't with them. A few minutes later, he appeared in the shadows of the hallway. He didn't go to the nurse's station to celebrate. He didn't go to his office. He walked toward the end of the hall, toward the large window that looked out over the Houston skyline, and stopped. He stood perfectly still, his back to the ward. Vivien watched him through her glass door. She saw his shoulders rise and fall in a jagged, uneven rhythm. Then she saw his hands. He had them pressed against the cold glass. Even from 10 feet away, Vivien could see the violent, uncontrollable tremor. The hands that had just performed a surgical miracle were shaking so hard they looked like they might shatter. This was the ghost of Incheon. He hadn't just saved a patient. He had just relived the moment he failed to save his own world. The trauma hadn't been a case to him. It had been a haunting. Vivien didn't think about her IV pole or her doctor's orders. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, the hospital-safe socks gripping the linoleum. She moved slowly, the plastic tubes trailing behind her like a train, and pushed open her heavy glass door. The sound of the door sliding open made him stiffen. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. "The baby is fine, Dr. Park," Vivien said softly. Her voice wasn't the voice of a patient. It was the voice of a woman who had sat at the bedside of 1,000 grieving mothers. "The mother is going to make it." "I know," he rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. "You did a good thing. I did my job." He finally pulled his hands from the window and shoved them deep into his coat pockets, hiding the shame of the tremor. He turned then, his face ashen, his eyes bloodshot behind his glasses. "You should be in bed, Mrs. Montgomery. Your vitals will spike." "Let them spike," Vivien said, taking a step closer. She didn't look at the chief of cardiology. She looked at the boy who had never gotten to say goodbye. "You're shaking, Sung-Ho." He flinched at the use of his first name. It was the first time anyone in this building had dared to speak it. "It's adrenaline," he lied, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. "Go back to your room." "It's not adrenaline. It's grief that's been held in for 10 years without a permit," Vivien said. She didn't reach for him. Not yet. She knew a wounded animal needed space before it could be touched. You saved them. You gave that man his wife and child back. You did what nobody could do for you." Sung Ho's eyes filled with a sudden, devastating moisture. He looked away, his throat working as he swallowed the sob that had been lodged there since his residency in Korea. "It doesn't change anything," he whispered. "It changes everything," Vivien replied. "It means the machine is broken, and praise God for that. I'd rather have a doctor with shaking hands who feels than one with steady hands who's dead." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, seeing past the hospital gown to the strength beneath. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't clinical. It was a bridge. But then the elevator dinged. A group of administrators stepped out, and the mask slammed back into place. Sung Ho straightened his coat, his face hardening into granite. "Get back in your bed, Vivien," he said, his voice cold once more. But as he walked past her, his sleeve brushed her arm, and she felt the heat of his skin. He wasn't a machine. He was a man on fire, and the ice was finally starting to melt. The evening light in the ICU was a bruised purple, the kind of hour that invited secrets. Vivien sat in her bed, her Bible open to the tear-stained pages of Lamentations, but her mind was 3 doors down, where the shadow of a man had been haunting the hallway. Deborah entered with a tray of evening meds, her usual bounce replaced by a heavy, thoughtful tread. She checked Vivian's blood pressure in silence, the Velcro cuff tearing the air with a sharp zip. "He's still in his office, isn't he?" Vivien asked softly. Deborah sighed, hanging the stethoscope around her neck. She looked at the door, then pulled up the rolling stool, sitting with the weary familiarity of a woman who had seen too much. "Lights are off, but he's in there. He's always in there when a case like today's comes through. It's like he's punishing himself for succeeding where he once failed." Vivien closed her Bible. "Tell me, Deborah. No more hospital rumors. Tell me what happened to that man." Deborah hesitated, then leaned in. "It was 10 years ago, back in Incheon. He was a rising star, just like he is now. He was on a double shift at the university hospital. His wife, Minsu, was 8 months pregnant with their first. A little girl, he once told me, when he'd had too much coffee and not enough sleep." Vivien felt a knot form in her stomach. "There was a storm," Deborah continued, her voice a low whisper. "Minsu was driving to bring him dinner because he'd forgotten to eat. A hydroplane, a truck. They brought her into the very ER where he was running the floor. He was the one who had to call the code. He was the one who had to tell the surgeons to stop because there was nothing left to save." Vivien gasped, her hand flying to her chest, not out of physical pain, but out of a sudden, crushing empathy. He was right there. He saw it. He held her hand until it went cold, and then he went to his locker, changed his shirt, and finished his shift. He hasn't stopped working since. His parents, they didn't make it any easier. Traditional folks. They blamed him for being at the hospital instead of at home where a real man belongs. They cut him off. He moved to Houston 2 months later. He didn't bring any furniture, just his degrees and that one photo he keeps in the drawer. Deborah stood up, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "So when you see him acting like a block of ice, Vivien, just remember, ice is just water that got too cold to move. He's protecting himself from the thaw." When Deborah left, the room felt smaller, the silence louder. Vivien looked down at her Bible. For days, she had been praying for the doctor. She had been asking God to guide his hands, to give him wisdom, to make him kind to her. It was a selfish prayer, she realized. It was a prayer for a service provider. She slid out of bed, her feet hitting the cold floor. She didn't go to the door this time. She knelt by the side of the plastic mattress, her knees clicking, her forehead resting against the cold metal rail. "Father," she breathed, her voice cracking, "forgive me. I've been looking at a white coat and missing the man. I've been asking for a physician, but you've placed a brother in my path." She took a breath, the scent of the pear tea still faintly lingering in the room. I'm not praying for Dr. Park tonight. I'm praying for Sung-ho. Lord, go into that dark office. Stand between him and that photo. Tell him that the blood on his hands from 10 years ago wasn't his fault. Tell him he doesn't have to save the whole world to earn the right to breathe. She stayed there for a long time, her prayer shifting from a request to a battle. She wasn't just a patient anymore. She was an intercessor. And Lord, she added, a tear finally escaping and hitting the linoleum, if you need a bridge to get to him, use me. I've got nothing left to lose, but the house Thomas wants, and I've got all the time in the world. Across the hall, the light under Sung-ho's door flickered on, then off again. He sat in the dark, his hand hovering over the silver frame, unaware that for the first time in a decade, someone wasn't calling out to the machine. Someone was calling his name to the Creator. The 11 p.m. hush of the ICU was different from any other silence on Earth. It was a pressurized quiet, vibrating with the hum of ventilators and the ghosts of prayers whispered in the dark. Vivien sat propped up in bed, the Bible resting on her lap like a shield. She had undergone a minor corrective procedure earlier that afternoon, a bridge to the major surgery looming on the horizon. The anesthesia had worn off, leaving her with a dull ache in her chest and a clarity in her soul that felt almost supernatural. The door slid open. Sung-ho didn't announce himself. He didn't have his tablet. He didn't have his swarm of residents. He looked like a man who had been stripped down to his primary elements. His eyes were rimmed with a raw, exhausted red. I need to check the site, he said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its clinical authority. Go ahead, doctor, Vivien said softly. He moved to the side of the bed, his movements mechanical. He peeled back the dressing on her femoral artery with a gentleness that contradicted his stony expression. But as he leaned closer to inspect the entry point, his hand betrayed him. The tremor was back. It wasn't just a flicker this time. It was a rhythmic, violent shudder that traveled from his fingertips to his elbow. He stopped, his hand suspended in midair, a look of profound, silent horror crossing his face. He stared at his own fingers as if they belonged to a traitor. Vivien didn't hesitate. She reached out and placed her hand over his. He froze. He didn't pull away, but every muscle in his body went rigid, as if he had been struck by lightning. His skin was ice cold. Hers was the heat of a furnace. Don't, he whispered, his eyes fixed on their joined hands. I am your physician. This is inappropriate. No, Vivien said, her voice a low, steady anchor. Right now, you're just a man whose cup is running over, and I'm just a woman who knows what it's like to have the world fall apart while you're trying to keep your hair straight. She turned his hand over, lacing her fingers through his. She didn't squeeze. She just stayed. You can let it go, Sung-ho. The baby is safe. The mother is safe. You don't have to keep the watch tonight. The mention of the baby was the final crack in the dam. A low, guttural sound, half gasp, half sob, broke from his throat. He slumped into the hard plastic chair beside her bed, his head dropping until it rested against the mattress near her hip. Then, the machine shattered. He wept. It wasn't a neat, cinematic cry. It was a violent, ugly, decade-late mourning that shook the entire bed. He cried for Minsu. He cried for the daughter who never took a breath. He cried for the cold, silent years in Houston and the parents who had made his grief a sin. Vivien placed her other hand on the back of his head, her fingers stroking his dark hair as if he were one of her own Sunday school children. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell him it was God's plan. She just held the space for his pain. After a long time, he lifted his head, his face wet and wrecked. He looked at her, but he wasn't seeing the ICU. He was looking at the ceiling, at the void, at the God he had ignored for 10 years. Why? He choked out. The question was a jagged blade. Why her? Why them? I was doing your work. I was saving lives. I followed every rule. Why did you take them and leave me in this desert? The silence that followed was heavy. Vivien didn't answer for God. She knew better than to try to explain the why of the Almighty. I don't know the why, she whispered, her eyes shining with her own tears. I'm sitting here with divorce papers in my Bible and a heart that's failing me after 30 years of service. I don't know why the rain falls on the just and the unjust, but I know this. She squeezed his hand, pulling his gaze back to hers. He didn't leave you in the desert to die. He left you there so you'd know his voice when he finally called you out. And he's calling you tonight. Sung-ho let out a long, shuddering breath. He leaned back in the chair, his hands still locked in hers, his eyes searching her face as if she were a map to a country he had forgotten. I don't know how to pray anymore, he admitted, his voice small. You just did, Vivien replied with a faint, tired smile. The why is the truest prayer there is. It means you're finally talking to him again. They sat there for an hour, the black woman from Houston and the doctor from Incheon, their hands clasped over a hospital bed. Outside, the world continued to turn, but inside room 402, the machine had finally died and a man had begun to live. The shift in the ward was palpable before a single word was spoken. It was in the way the air seemed to lose its antiseptic bite, replaced by something that felt suspiciously like hope. It was 7 a.m. Vivien had just finished her morning devotion when the door slid open. Sung-ho didn't enter with the usual flurry of charts and cold efficiency. He was dressed in charcoal slacks and a soft cream sweater under his white coat, looking less like a statue and more like a man who had actually slept. In his hands, he carried a thermal container, the steam smelling of toasted sesame and comfort. The hospital food is nutritionally adequate, but it lacks soul, he said, his voice regaining its depth but losing its edge. He set the container on her tray and opened it. What's this? Vivien asked, her eyes brightening. It is juke, he explained, carefully spooning the thick, velvety rice porridge into a bowl. Korean rice porridge. My mother used to make it whenever the heart was weary. I added abalone and ginger. It's for your recovery, for the physical heart, and the other one. Vivien took a bite. It was warm, savory, and rich, the kind of food that tastes like an apology and a promise all at once. It's delicious, Sung-ho. You made this yourself? I was up at 4, he admitted, a slight, almost imperceptible flush creeping up his neck. I found I didn't want to sit in the silence of my kitchen anymore. As she ate, Vivien began to hum. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to fill the corners of the room. I've seen the lightning flashing and heard the thunder roll. Sung-ho paused, his hand on her IV line. That melody, it's familiar. I heard you humming it during your checkup yesterday. It's an old hymn, No, Never Alone, Vivien said, wiping her lips. My grandmother used to sing it while she hung laundry. It's about the promise that no matter how dark the valley, there's a hand in the shadows. She looked at him, her eyes twinkling. You've got a good voice, doctor. I can hear it in the way you speak. Try it with me. I don't think the chief of cardiology should be singing in the ICU, he demurred, though he didn't move toward the door. The chief of cardiology is off the clock for another 5 minutes. The man, however, is right here. She began again, louder this time. He promised never to leave me alone. Sung-ho hesitated. Then his voice joined hers, a rich, untrained baritone that harmonized perfectly with her velvet alto. No, never alone. No, never alone. Outside the room, at the nurse's station, the world stopped. Deborah froze with a syringe in midair. 2 residents stared at each other, their mouths agape. Through the glass partition, They didn't see the machine. They saw Dr. Park sitting on the edge of a patient's bed, his head tilted back, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across his face like a sunrise. Is he singing?" a junior resident whispered. "Hush!" Deborah snapped, though her own eyes were misty. "He's breathing. There's a difference." The whispers started immediately, a wildfire of gossip that wasn't malicious but awestruck. The machine had been dismantled, and in its place was a man who brought homemade porridge to a woman from a different world. As the hymn ended, the room fell into a comfortable, golden silence. "Thank you, Vivien," Sung-ho said, standing up and smoothing his coat. "For the lesson." "Grace is a free gift, Sung-ho. You just have to be willing to open your hands to catch it." He nodded, his smile lingering even as he turned back to the hallway. But as he stepped out, his face didn't return to stone. He greeted the nurses. He nodded at the janitor. He looked like a man who had finally found the rhythm of his own heart. However, the peace was interrupted by the chime of the elevator. The door slid open to reveal a woman in a tailored silk hanbok coat, her expression sharp enough to cut glass. Behind her stood an older man with a rigid military bearing. The smile died on Sung-ho's face. The old law had arrived from Incheon. The atmosphere in the ICU didn't just cool, it crystallized. Mrs. Park did not walk into the ward so much as she occupied it. She was a woman of porcelain skin and iron will, dressed in a muted slate-gray silk coat that whispered of old money and older expectations. Behind her, Mr. Park stood like a silent sentinel, his face a map of unyielding tradition. Sung-ho met them in the center of the hallway. The change in him was instantaneous. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and the warmth Vivien had just cultivated in him seemed to retreat into a bunker. "Mother, father," Sung-ho said in Korean, his voice formal and hollow. "You didn't say you were coming." "We heard rumors that our son had forgotten his place," Mrs. Park replied, her English perfect and sharp. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the creases in his coat, then past him, her eyes landing on the glass door of room 402. She walked past him without permission, her heels clicking a rhythmic, judgmental pulse. She stopped at the threshold of Vivian's room. Vivien sat up straighter, her Bible still in her lap. She felt the woman's gaze. It wasn't the gaze of a doctor, nor a curious stranger. It was the gaze of a woman measuring the purity of a bloodline and finding Vivien wanting. Mrs. Park's eyes raked over Vivian's dark skin, her hair, and the worn leather of the Bible. "So," Mrs. Park said, turning back to Sung-ho, "this is the prayer that has turned the chief of cardiology into a cook." "Mother, stop," Sung-ho said, his voice low and warning. Mrs. Park ignored him, stepping fully into the room. She stood at the foot of the bed, smelling of expensive lilies and cold air. "Mrs. Montgomery, is it? My son is a man of science. He is a Park. He has a legacy of excellence that stretches back generations. He does not have time for distractions, especially those that do not align with our family's standing." Vivien felt the rage trigger pull, but she kept her voice as smooth as Riverstone. "Your son is a man of God, Mrs. Park, whether he's realized it yet or not. And as for standing, we're all at the same height when we're lying in a hospital bed." Mrs. Park's lip curled. "A clever tongue. But you are a patient. You are a woman of a certain background, and you are far older than he. My son has already suffered through one mistake. A woman from a family with no name who cost him everything." Sung-ho's breath hitched. "Don't speak of Minsu. I speak of reality." Mrs. Park turned on him, her voice rising in the quiet ward. "You moved across the ocean to escape your grief, but you have only found a different way to disgrace us. Bringing food, singing. You are a surgeon, not a servant. This woman is a patient, Sung-ho. She is a project of your guilt. Do not mistake your pity for something that would make your ancestors ashamed. Pity? Sung-ho stepped closer, his body shielding Vivien from his mother's glare. For the first time, he wasn't looking at his mother with the eyes of a dutiful son. He was looking at her as a man who had finally seen the bars of his cage. You didn't even come. You stayed in Inshin because Minsu wasn't good enough. You let me grieve alone for 10 years. You don't get to tell me who is worthy of my time. We saved you from a life of mediocrity, Mrs. Park snapped. She looked at Vivien with a chilling finality. Enjoy your recovery, Mrs. Montgomery, but do not think for a moment that you belong in my son's world. You are a footnote in his career. Nothing more. She turned and swept out of the room, Mr. Park following like a shadow that had never learned to speak. The silence that remained was jagged. Sung-ho stood with his back to Vivien, his hands fisted at his sides. The tremor was gone, replaced by a rigid, vibrating anger. I am sorry, he whispered. She has no right. She's scared, Sung-ho, Vivien said softly, though her own heart was thundering. People like her think that if they control the light, the darkness can't get in. But she doesn't realize she's the one keeping you in the dark. Sung-ho turned, and for a second, the machine flickered back. A defense mechanism against the pain his mother had just reopened. She is wrong about one thing, Sung-ho said, his voice cracking. You aren't a footnote. But as he looked out into the hallway, where his parents were already speaking to the hospital administrator, Vivien saw the weight of the old law settling back onto his shoulders. The battle for his soul hadn't just moved to the church. It had become a war of heritage. The smell of Thomas's cologne always preceded him, a heavy, expensive musk that smelled like ambition and betrayal. Vivien smelled him before the door even clicked open. She was sitting up, her Bible open to the book of Nehemiah, a chapter on rebuilding walls. Sung-ho was standing by the window, explaining the logistics of her upcoming surgery with a gentleness that would have shocked his colleagues. He was mid-sentence when the door swung wide, hitting the rubber stopper with a dull thrum. Thomas Montgomery walked in like he owned the floor. He was wearing his Sunday deacon suit, the silk tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes were hard and narrow. He held a leather portfolio under one arm, the weight of 30 years of marriage reduced to a few sheets of bond paper. Vivien, Thomas said, ignoring the man in the white coat. Tasha said you were being difficult. I brought the notary. He's waiting in the lobby. We're going to sign the quitclaim on the Sugarland house right now. Vivien felt the familiar, cold squeeze of anxiety in her chest. For decades, this man's voice had been her command. Thomas, I told you, I'm not signing away my home from an ICU bed. It's not your home anymore, Thomas snapped, stepping closer. It's an asset, and I'm not letting you sit on it while you play act this ailing saint routine. Sign the papers, Vivien. Don't make me get the lawyers to declare you incompetent. Sung-ho stepped forward. He didn't move fast, but he moved with a terrifying, quiet gravity. He placed himself directly between Thomas and the bed, a physical wall of white linen and authority. You are distressing my patient, Sung-ho said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the chill of a winter morning in the mountains of Korea. Thomas finally looked at him, his lip curling in a dismissive sneer. And who are you? The help? Step aside, son. This is family business. I am Dr. Sung-ho Park, Chief of Cardiology, Sung-ho replied. His eyes locked onto Thomas's with a steadiness that made the deacon blink. And in this room, my authority is absolute. You are not family right now. You are a physiological stressor, and I am telling you to leave. Thomas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. A stressor? I'm her husband. I've been her husband since before you were in medical school. Vivien, tell this man to move. Vivien looked at Thomas, really looked at him. She saw the vanity, the hollow pride, and the way he looked at her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. Then she looked at the broad back of the doctor who had wept before her, who had cooked for her, and who was currently standing in the gap for her. "He's not moving, Thomas," Vivien said, her voice finding a new crystalline strength. "And neither am I. I'm not signing anything. Not today. Not ever." Thomas's face turned a mottled purple. He stepped toward Sung-ho, trying to use his height to intimidate him. "You think you're a hero? You're just a doctor. You don't know who I am in this city. I can have your board." "I don't care who you are," Sung-ho interrupted. He took a single step forward, forcing Thomas to retreat an inch. Sung-ho was shorter, but he carried the weight of a man who had stared into the abyss and survived. "I have seen the way you look at her. You look at her heart like it is a pump that has outlived its usefulness. I look at it and see a miracle that is fighting to stay alive despite the weight you have piled on it." Sung-ho's hand went to the call button. "If you do not leave in 10 seconds, I will call security, and then I will call the police to report a man attempting to coerce a post-operative patient into signing legal documents under duress." I imagine the deacon would not like that headline. The silence in the room was a live wire. Thomas looked at Vivien, then at the doctor. He saw the cold, immovable resolve in Sung-ho's eyes, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Thomas tucked the leather portfolio tighter under his arm. "Fine. You want to play it this way? We'll do it in court. Vivien, I hope he's worth the trouble, because when the insurance runs out and the church moves on, you're going to be a lonely woman in a very small apartment." "I've been lonely for 30 years in a very big house, Thomas," Vivien said quietly. "I think I'll handle the apartment just fine." Thomas turned and stormed out, the door hissing shut behind him. The tension in the room didn't dissipate immediately. It transformed. Sung-ho didn't turn around for a long moment. He stood with his shoulders slumped, his chest heaving as the adrenaline ebbed away. When he finally turned, his face was pale. "I should not have lost my temper. It was unprofessional." "No," Vivien said, reaching out her hand. He took it, his fingers wrapping around hers with a desperate grounding strength. "It was the most professional thing I've ever seen. You protected the patient's heart, Dr. Park." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "He is a fool. He has no idea what he is throwing away." "He never did," Vivien whispered. But as they stood there, the weight of the world felt heavy again. They both knew that Thomas wouldn't stop, and Mrs. Park was still in the building, weaving a different kind of net. The afternoon sun was a harsh, golden blade cutting across the ICU linoleum. Vivien was resting, her eyes closed, when the air in the room suddenly sharpened. She didn't need to open her eyes to know that the old law had returned. Mrs. Park stood at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped over a designer handbag, her face a mask of porcelain indifference. Behind her, the hospital administrator, a man named Henderson, who looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours, stood shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Mrs. Montgomery," Mrs. Park began, her voice a soft, lethal silk, "we should speak plainly. My husband and I have spent 40 years building our son's path. We did not survive the hardships of Incheon for him to be ruined by a scandal in Houston." Vivien sat up, the familiar ache in her chest throbbing. "A scandal? A doctor caring for a patient is a scandal now? When that doctor abandons his duties to cook for her? When he insults a respected deacon of your community to protect her?" "Yes," Mrs. Park replied. She leaned in, her eyes cold as deep-sea ice. "The board of directors is meeting tonight. Mr. Henderson has received a formal complaint from your husband regarding unprofessional intimacy. My son's residency, his board certification, his entire future here is on a precipice. They will strip him of his chief position by morning." Vivian's breath hitched. He was only doing what a human being should do. He is not a human being to the board, Mrs. Park snapped. He is an investment. If you truly care for him, if your God truly teaches sacrifice, then you will realize that you are the poison in his cup. As long as you are in this bed, he will keep burning his life down to keep you warm. Henderson stepped forward, looking pained. Mrs. Montgomery, if you were to be transferred, or if you were to leave, the complaint might be viewed as a misunderstanding. But as it stands, Dr. Park is refusing to step away from your case. He's jeopardizing everything. Vivien looked past them toward the glass door. She saw Sung Ho in the distance, hunched over a chart, a small, tired smile on his face as he spoke to a nurse. He looked alive for the first time in a decade, and because of her, they were going to kill that life before it could bloom. She felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. This was what the elders meant by the assignment. Sometimes, the miracle wasn't the healing of the body, it was the saving of the soul. And once the soul was saved, the witness had to step out of the way. "Leave me," Vivien said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Once the room was empty, Vivien didn't cry. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy. She pulled the IV tape from her arm, wincing as the needle slid out. She ignored the frantic chirp, chirp, chirp of the heart monitor as it lost her pulse. She dressed herself in the clothes Tasha had brought days ago, a simple knit dress and a cardigan. She grabbed her Bible. The divorce papers were still tucked inside, but they felt light now, irrelevant. She found Deborah in the supply closet. "I'm checking out, Deborah. AMA, against medical advice." "Vivien, are you crazy? You have surgery in 3 days. You'll die." "I'm not gonna die," Vivien said, grabbing Deborah's hands. Her eyes were burning with a fierce, spiritual fire. "God didn't send me here for a surgery, Deborah. He sent me for a man. The assignment is done. If I stay, they'll take his coat. They'll take his joy. I won't let his mother win by letting him lose his dream." "He'll come for you," Deborah whispered. "Tell him not to. Tell him to be the doctor his wife would be proud of." Vivien slipped out the service exit, the humid Houston air hitting her like a physical blow. She hailed a taxi, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. As the car pulled away, she looked back at the towering glass of the medical center. The silence in room 402 was louder than the sirens. Sung Ho stood paralyzed at the foot of the bed. The flatline tone of the heart monitor had finally been silenced by a technician, leaving a vacuum in the air that felt heavy enough to crush his lungs. A moment ago, this room had been a sanctuary of ginger, hymns, and the steady, rhythmic promise of a heart being mended. Now, it was just a collection of plastic, metal, and unspent oxygen. He stepped forward, his shoes clicking hollowly on the floor. He touched the sheets. They were still slightly warm. "She can't be gone," he whispered to the empty room. His medical mind raced through the data. Stenosis, high risk. A MA status is a death sentence. But his soul, the part of him Vivien had so carefully excavated, felt a different kind of terror. He saw it then. A small, white square of paper resting exactly where her head had been. He picked it up. His hands, the hands he had bragged were the best in Texas, were shaking so violently he had to grip the paper with both thumbs to still it. He read the words once, twice. By the third time, the ink began to blur under a hot, sudden moisture. "Your wife would be so proud of the man you're becoming." He collapsed into the chair, the same chair where he had wept, where he had eaten juck, where he had learned that he wasn't a god in a white coat, but a man in need of grace. He realized then that Vivien hadn't just been a patient he was saving. She had been the oxygen mask he didn't know he was wearing. "Dr. Park?" He didn't look up. He couldn't. Deborah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes red. She didn't offer the usual clinical comfort. She looked at him with a fierce, disappointed pity. "She left to save you, Sung Ho." Deborah said, her voice echoing in the sterile box. Your mother and that administrator. They cornered her. They told her she was the anchor dragging you down. So she did what she's been doing for 30 years. She sacrificed herself so someone else could stay afloat. Sung-ho looked at the note again. The man you're becoming. She's going to die, Deborah, he rasped. Without that surgery, she's a walking time bomb. The stress of Thomas, the stress of this. Her heart can't take it. Then find her, Deborah said, stepping into the room. The board is meeting in 30 minutes to discuss your unprofessionalism. Your parents are waiting in the lobby to take you to dinner and celebrate their victory. You can stay here and be the chief. You can be the machine. You can have the career they built for you. She leaned over the bed, looking him directly in the eye. Or you can go be the man she prayed for. Sung-ho looked at the empty bed. He thought of the decade he had spent as a ghost, haunting the halls of this hospital, pretending that his clinical excellence was a substitute for being alive. He realized he didn't want the title if it meant the silence was back. He didn't want the machine if it meant the heart he had just found was going to stop beating in a house in Houston while he sat in a board meeting. He stood up. He didn't take his tablet. He didn't grab his stethoscope. Where is she? He asked. She wouldn't say, Deborah whispered, but she said she'd be singing. Sung-ho didn't wait for another word. He turned and ran. He didn't run like a doctor toward a code. He ran like a man escaping a collapsing building. He bypassed the boardroom. He bypassed his parents, who stood up in the lobby calling his name in shocked Korean. He burst through the hospital's revolving doors into the humid evening air. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't have a plan. He didn't have a diagnosis. He only had a note, a prayer, and a desperate driving need to find the woman who had traded her life for his peace. The hospital chapel was a room designed for a god of neutrality. It had no crosses, no icons, and no warmth, just 4 beige walls, a few rows of padded chairs, and a silence that felt like it was waiting for bad news. Sung-ho sat in the front row, his white coat draped over the chair beside him like a discarded skin. He looked at his hands. They were still. They were empty. The board meeting was happening 4 floors up, and for the first time in his career, he didn't care about the verdict. The heavy oak door creaked. Deborah walked in, her footsteps echoing. She didn't sit in the chairs. She stood in the center of the aisle, her hands on her hips. I figured I'd find you in here, she said, the one place in the building where you can't see a monitor. She's gone, Deborah, Sung-ho said, his voice a flat, dead thing. I've checked every clinic. I've called her daughter. Tasha hung up on me. She's out there with a heart that is 90% occluded, and I am sitting in a room with a plastic altar. Deborah walked closer, her face hardening. You know, for a world-renowned cardiologist, you're real stupid about matters of the heart. Sung-ho looked up, a flash of his old arrogance flickering in his eyes. I'm the one who mapped the blood flow, Deborah. I know exactly how much time she has. I'm not talking about blood flow, Deborah barked, her voice bouncing off the sterile walls. I'm talking about life. You think she left because she was scared of surgery? That woman has faced down lions in her own living room for 30 years. She left because she saw you looking at her like she was your second chance. And then your mother. She knew your mother would kill your career to stop her. She sacrificed her life to save your reputation. And here you are, sitting in the dark, letting her do it. Sung-ho stood up, his jaw tight. What am I supposed to do? I don't even know where she is. She's at her church, you genius, Deborah snapped. It's Sunday morning. Where else would a woman like Vivian Montgomery go when she thinks she's meeting her maker? She told me once, if I'm gonna go, I'm gonna go while the choir is in the key of G. Deborah reached into her pocket and threw a crumpled piece of paper at his chest. He caught it. It was a printed bulletin. Greater Hope Baptist Church, Now, you can sit here and be a brilliant doctor who let the best thing that ever happened to him walk out the door, Deborah said, turning toward the exit. Or you can go get your woman. But don't you dare come back to my ward and tell me you're a healer if you won't even try to heal the one person who gave you your soul back. The door slammed shut. Sung-ho was alone again. The silence rushed back in, but this time it was different. It felt expectant. He looked at the small wooden podium at the front of the room. He hadn't spoken to God since the rain in Incheon. He hadn't asked for anything since he asked for his wife to open her eyes and she didn't. He walked to the podium. He didn't kneel. His knees wouldn't move. But he bowed his head until his forehead touched the cool wood. "I don't know the rules," he whispered. His voice sounded small in the high-ceilinged room. "I don't have her songs. I don't have her faith." He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could smell the ginger and the pear tea. He could hear the low, resonant hum of her voice. "But you sent her," he choked out, his fingers gripping the edge of the wood until his knuckles turned white. "You sent her to a man who didn't want to be found. You used a broken heart to fix mine. So, if you're still there, if you really are the God she says you are, don't let her die in the dark. Give me 1 hour, just 1 hour, to tell her that I heard you." The air in the chapel didn't change. There was no lightning, no choir of angels. But as Sung-ho stood up, the crushing weight in his chest, the weight he had mistaken for grief for 10 years, was gone. He didn't grab his white coat. He didn't grab his pager. He walked out of the chapel, through the lobby. He got into his car and drove toward the east side, toward a steeple he had never seen, following the sound of a song he was finally beginning to understand. The sun over Houston was a relentless, shimmering weight, but inside Greater Hope Baptist, the air was thick with the scent of mahogany, peppermint, and 1,000 whispered prayers. Vivien sat in her usual pew, 3rd row from the front. She felt like a glass ornament that had been glued back together. Beautiful, but one sharp vibration away from shattering. Every breath was a conscious effort, a shallow sip of air taken against the tightening grip of her own heart. The choir was mid-refrain, a glorious, earth-shaking rendition of total praise. The organist was leaning into the keys, the bass notes vibrating through the floorboards and into Vivien's very marrow. She closed her eyes, letting the sound carry her. She had come home to say goodbye, even if the congregation didn't know it yet. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the sanctuary groaned open. In a church of 500 people, the shift in atmosphere was instantaneous. It started as a ripple of hushed confusion near the back and moved forward like a wave. Heads turned. The singing didn't stop, but it faltered, the energy in the room snagging on something foreign. Vivien opened her eyes. She felt a jolt of electricity that didn't come from a defibrillator. Standing in the center aisle was a man who looked like he had run a marathon through a storm. Sung-ho was not in his white coat. He was in a rumpled charcoal suit, his tie gone, his hair disheveled. He stood at the threshold of a world he didn't belong to, a lone Korean man in a sea of Sunday hats and African print, and he looked utterly, terrifyingly at home. He began to walk. He didn't look at the deacons who stood up in surprise. He didn't look at Thomas, who was sitting in the honor section, his face twisting into a mask of indignant rage. Sung-ho looked only at Vivien. The pastor, a man of great discernment named Reverend Hightower, signaled the choir to a soft hum. The music didn't die. It became a heartbeat. Sung-ho reached the altar rail. He didn't stop. He turned to face the congregation, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a light that wasn't clinical. "My name is Dr. Sung-ho Park," he began. His voice, usually so contained, projected to the very back of the rafters. It was raw. It was shaking. I am the chief of cardiology at the medical center. For 10 years, I have been a man of science. I believed that the heart was a machine, and when it broke, it was my job to fix the parts. He paused, his gaze flickering to Vivian. She was gripping the back of the pew in front of her, her knuckles white. I was wrong, Sung-ho said, his voice cracking. I spent 30 days with one of your own. I watched Vivian Montgomery pray for everyone except herself. I heard her speak to a God I had abandoned, asking him to carry a burden she didn't even know I had. She held my hand while I wept for a life I thought was over. She gave me back my faith before she even knew my middle name. A low chorus of and Lord have mercy rose from the pews. She left the hospital to save my career, Sung-ho continued, his voice rising in power. She chose my life over her own because she is a woman of the assignment. But I am standing here today to tell her, that the career is nothing. The coat is nothing. If I am a healer, it is because she healed the healer first. He turned fully to Vivian then. He stepped toward her pew, ignoring the gasps. He didn't kneel to pray. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a resonant, intimate tone that somehow reached every ear in the room. Vivian, I am not here as your doctor. I am not here to tell you your vitals. I am here to ask this church, to ask your family, your brothers and sisters, for permission to love you, properly, honestly, before God and man. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Then, a single voice. Sister Martha let out a piercing, joyous, "Hallelujah!" It was the spark that hit the powder keg. The congregation erupted. People stood, weeping and shouting. The organist hit a chord that shook the stained glass. In the midst of the holy chaos, Sung-ho reached out his hand. Vivian took it, her fingers trembling as they locked into his. She felt the strength of him, the life of him, and for the first time in 30 years, the weight in her chest didn't feel like a stenosis. It felt like an answer. "You're late for service, doctor," she whispered through her tears. "I stayed for the altar call," he replied, a radiant, broken smile finally claiming his face. The aftermath of the church scene didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a beginning. The sanctuary was still humming with the residue of a miracle when the crowd began to part. At the very back of Greater Hope Baptist, standing beneath the shadow of the balcony, was a figure that didn't fit the joy of the room. Mrs. Park stood alone. Her husband had already retreated to the car, but she remained, her silk coat a muted gray against the vibrant tapestry of the congregation. Vivien, supported by Sung-ho's steady arm, began the long walk down the aisle. The church members reached out to touch her sleeve, to pat Sung-ho's shoulder, a literal laying on of hands. As they reached the vestibule, they came face to face with the matriarch of Incheon. The air grew still. Sung-ho braced himself, his jaw tightening as he prepared to defend the woman he loved against his mother's final judgment. But Mrs. Park didn't speak. Her eyes, usually as sharp as surgical steel, were wet. She looked at Vivian, not as a patient, not as a stranger, but as the woman who had accomplished in 30 days what she hadn't been able to do in 30 years. She looked at her son and saw a man who was finally, truly, standing upright. Slowly, deliberately, Mrs. Park tucked her handbag under her arm. She placed her hands at her sides and bent her waist. She performed a deep, traditional Korean bow, a gesture of profound respect and apology that went beyond words. "Thank you," Mrs. Park whispered in careful, trembling English as she rose, "for giving me back my son." Vivian didn't let her stay in that place of debt. She reached out and took the older woman's hands. The silk and the knit met. He was never lost, Mrs. Park. God just needed him to be still long enough to hear the answer. and I think we're all hearing it now. The fluorescent lights of the surgical waiting room felt different when you weren't the one wearing the scrubs. To Sung-ho, they felt predatory, flickering with the cold indifference of a clock ticking toward a verdict he couldn't control. He sat in a low-slung vinyl chair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were the color of bone. To his left sat Deborah, who had traded her nursing station for a seat of solidarity. To his right sat his mother. Mrs. Park didn't look like the iron-willed matriarch today. She looked like a woman who had finally realized that some hearts cannot be commanded, only cherished. "The bypass is a standard procedure, Sung-ho," Deborah whispered, though her own eyes were fixed on the double doors. "You've done 1,000 of them." "I have never done one where my own soul was on the table," Sung-ho replied. His voice was thick. He looked at the floor, his lips moving in a silent, frantic rhythm. He wasn't reciting surgical steps. He was reciting the 23rd Psalm, the words Vivien had whispered to him when he was the one in the white coat. The doors swung open with a pneumatic hiss. Dr. Aris, a man Sung-ho had personally mentored, stepped out. He was pulling his mask down, his face slick with sweat. Sung-ho stood so abruptly, his chair screeched against the tile. He couldn't find his voice. He looked at Aris with the desperate raw hunger of a man begging for life. Aris looked at the chief of cardiology, then at the two women waiting behind him. A slow, weary grin broke across his face. He gave a sharp, definitive thumbs up. "The assignment isn't over, Sung-ho. She's in recovery. Her heart is beating like a drum." Sung-ho didn't cheer. He didn't shake hands. He sank back into the chair, buried his face in his palms, and let out a sob of pure, unadulterated gratitude, while his mother placed a trembling hand on his shoulder and prayed in Korean for the first time in a decade. The lawyer's office was paneled in dark, expensive mahogany, smelling of old paper and the bitter scent of expensive espresso. Thomas Montgomery sat across from his counsel, his signature Sunday deacon suit looking a size too large for his frame. The lawyer pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk. "It's done, Thomas. The Sugar Land property is yours. She didn't fight for the equity. She didn't fight for the retirement accounts. She walked away with her car, her clothes, and her Bible." Thomas picked up the pen. This was the moment he had wanted. The moment where he won, where he was free of the church house expectations and the woman who made him feel like he was always second place to a God he only pretended to serve. He signed his name. The ink was black and permanent. "She's already moved into a cottage near the medical center," the lawyer added, stacking the files. "Tasha helped her move. Your daughter. She's staying there on the weekends, Thomas." Thomas looked at the winner side of the ledger. He had the house. He had the furniture. He had the status. But as he looked at the empty chair beside him, a silence began to fill the room. A deafening, hollow ringing that no amount of Sugarland real estate could drown out. He had the house, but the home had left the building. He walked out into the Houston heat, a wealthy man who had never been more bankrupt. The cottage was small, but the windows were wide, letting in the amber glow of a Texas sunset. The air inside was a fragrant battleground, the sharp, fermented tang of kimchi jjigae clashing beautifully with the buttery, sweet aroma of cornbread cooling on the counter. "Is it supposed to be this red?" Her voice soft and humbler than it had been in years. She was carefully placing a bowl of a spicy stew in front of Mr. Park. "The red means it has life in it, baby," Vivien laughed, looking radiant in a simple linen dress, her chest rising and falling with a deep, easy breath. Sung-ho sat at the head of the table watching his father. Mr. Park, a man of rigid tradition and few words, stared at the slice of sweet potato pie Vivien had placed on his bread plate. He took a cautious bite. His eyes widened, a look of quiet, sugary shock crossing his face. "It is very sweet," Mr. Park said in Korean. then looked at Vivien and nodded. Good. It is good. Vivien reached out under the table and found Sung-ho's hand. They weren't in an ICU anymore. They weren't fighting for survival. They were a family, messy, culturally collided, and stitched together by a grace that didn't care about borders. The hospital chapel didn't need flowers. The light coming through the east-facing windows at 6 a.m. provided all the decoration necessary, painting the room in hues of rose and gold. It was a small circle. Deborah stood as maid of honor, her fancy floral scrubs a testament to her life's work. Mrs. Park sat in the front row, holding a lace handkerchief. Reverend Hightower stood before them, his voice a low rumble. In the presence of God and these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife. Sung-ho didn't wait for the cue. He took Vivien's face in his hands, the hands that were now as steady as a mountain. He didn't go for a grand, cinematic kiss. Instead, he pulled her close and rested his forehead against hers. They stood there for a long beat, their eyes closed, their breathing synchronized. It was a silent covenant, a promise that from this day forward, he would be the rhythm and she would be the song. Two hearts that had both been broken in the ICU were now beating as one, perfectly in tune. I love you, Vivien Park, he whispered. And I love you, Sung-ho, she replied. Now let's go. We've got work to do. 2 years later. The new Montgomery Park Cardiac Wing is quiet in the blue hour of evening. A young man, barely 20, sits in room 402. He looks terrified, his eyes fixed on the heart monitor. He is alone, his family still stuck at a border crossing 1,000 miles away. The door slides open. 2 people enter. Dr. Sung-ho Park, his white coat now softened by a wedding ring on his finger, and Vivien Park, the wing's lead patient advocate, dressed in a vibrant purple suit. They don't start with the chart. They don't start with the diagnosis. Vivien moves to the left side of the bed and takes the young man's hand. Sung-ho moves to the right. I know it's heavy, Vivien says, her voice a warm, familiar velvet. I spent a lot of time in this bed, son, but you aren't carrying this by yourself. Sung-ho looks across the bed at his wife, his eyes reflecting a decade's worth of found grace. He reaches out, and as they hold the patient's hands, they also find each other's fingers over the linens. Let's talk to the one who made the heart before we try to fix it, Sung-ho says. The end. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more Christ-centered love stories of healing, hope, and love. And if you don't want to miss what God does in the next story, turn on notifications so you're always here when a new chapter drops. Until next time, keep believing in the grace of God that defies all odds.